visiting speaker, Kelly Wainwright, who is the curator at Burton Constable Hall. I'm not going to say any more, I'll let Kelly tell you about all the things that she does. Just to let you know, we do have a speaker on next week because there's been a little bit of disruption with the speakers. And it's James Stewart, and he's going to be a couture fashion designer who's going to come and speak to you. He lives and works in Leeds, but I think he has quite a lot of high-profile clients in terms of celebrities and so forth and so on. So that's on next week at the usual time. Yeah, so I'll pass you on to Kelly.
Right. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here to speak to you today. Just to give you a little bit of a background on me, my name is Kelly Wainwright. I'm the curator for Burton Constable Hall. I'm not actually from an art and design background. I studied history and archaeology at undergrad and then decided that I wanted to go on and pursue a career in the museum sector. So I went to study museum and heritage management. However, the reason why I've been invited here today is my role now as managing or curating a historic building like Burton Constable is a very varied role. And in addition to the historical research collections management side, a large part of my role takes in the skills of artists and designers. And a lot of the projects that we now do as a museum and what we undertake involve commissioning conservators, artists, designers to advise and provide solutions for a lot of the challenges that we come across with a building like Burton Constable. Sometimes these are freelance, sometimes it's through a funded project, I'll just put my names today on, which is tendered out. So I suppose as Steve kind of put it right earlier, I'm sort of, if somebody is thinking of setting up as freelance artists and designers, my role is sort of the person who would be seeking out people like you to help me with some of the challenges that I have in my role. So it's to give you a bit of a taster of the other side of it, and hopefully to introduce you a bit to the heritage sector. Essentially my role as a curator then is to care for the historic collections and interiors, but also to encourage people to visit them, learn from them and be inspired. My job can range from seeking conservators to help restore an individual object, recreating an entire room interior, to putting together displays and putting on exhibitions aimed at different audiences. More recently as well, I just touched on this, in the museum sector as a whole and at Burton Constable, we've been recognising the need to go just beyond the museum and the collections in order to create an overall visitor experience, which brings in things like having to ensure that you have a good shop and tea room, a well-designed website, effective marketing. And all of this often involves out-seeking designers, marketing experts, artists and other such contractors to help get the image right. Museum staff museums as an industry, with the economic situation, tend to be quite low staffing now, tend to be quite underfunded, and yet we're expected to be a bit of a jack of all trades. So it's impossible nowadays for curators to be skilled in all these areas. So we're seeing a great increase for a demand for freelance consultants, for artist designers. And that's really where I suppose you guys, hopefully in the future, could come in. There's often a lot of funding opportunities for projects like this as well, especially projects aimed at strengthening a museum's offer to visitors, where there'll be funding available through a project to recruit a consultant or an artist to work with. So really the aim of my talk today is to introduce you to the many different opportunities that there are for artists and designers to work within the museum heritage sector, and to the challenges of managing a building like Burton Constable. So just a bit of an overview, give you a quick history of the whole, a bit of work of the work we do in terms of conservation and reinstating rooms. Also funding for projects, because that's probably a key thing, is how do we get the money to pay for a lot of this work, and as artists how do you get people who have the funds to commission such work. So I'll touch on some of the big funding bodies like Heritage Lottery and Arts Council, and then just what other opportunities there are for artists in a place like Burton Constable Hall. So for those of you who don't already know a bit about the history of the Hall, Burton Constable is a large Elizabethan mansion in the East Riding of Yorkshire, home to the Constable family for over 700 years. It's one of the most fascinating country houses to survive with its original collections and interiors. And that's really key as part of my role as Burton Constable, that everything we have there is actually true to the history of the hall, their original collections, original interiors, and that underpins a lot of the decisions that we have to make and causes many challenges. Today it's owned by the Burton Constable Foundation. We are an independent charitable trust which were set up and endowed in 1992 to maintain and make accessible Burton Constable Hall. So we're not local authority, we're not national trust, we're an independent charity, and that limits our funding streams as well, so we have to be creative in how we go about a lot of the projects that we try to do. The history of the building actually dates back, begins in the 1560s with Sir John Constable. Now, having already amassed a great fortune through masterful dealings, he then went on to purchase the title Lordship of the Senior of Holderness for a sum of £4,000 in 1560s. I don't actually know what that translates to in today's money, but billionaires by today's standards. It extended their lands in the Holderness, East Yorkshire area, making him the wealthiest landowner, and thus he required a residence to match and embarked on the building of Burton Constable Hall. The hall then always remained in the Constable family line of descent, which is another key part to its history. It wasn't sold off where collections were lost. You've got an entire evolution of the same family occupying this huge mansion. And that's one of the reasons it survives well. And you can see the developments over the many centuries in different rooms throughout the house. In the 18th century, the house and grounds undertook a major grand refurbishment as part of William Constable's elaborate modernisation scheme. So this is why you've got an Elizabethan building with a lot of 18th century interiors. Because they were Catholics, they were barred from this, they were barred from being involved in the military or politicians. So he's basically electing to spend his wealth showing off his fine taste and pursuing a life of the arts and sciences. And he employed the finest architects and craftsmen of the day to do this. So this is kind of a rather self-droll description of himself, where he talks in a letter to his brother-in-law about how he is employing the best artists of the kingdom. I won't read it all out. So one of the major rooms that undertook a modernisation is the Great Hall, the first room that visitors are greeted with. Originally there would have been some kind of Tudor screen, but William elected to go with a Jacobean scheme, and he was very keen to display his ancestral heritage as well, so he kind of commissioned these huge armorial shields around the place, showing the fact that his ancestral heritage, his nobility, can be traced all the way back to the 1190. He was a bit of an enlightened thinker as well. He was a great collector, and his tastes and his character are kind of reflected in the artworks that he collected during this period and the designs he took in. Quite amusingly, all the portraits we seem to have of William Constable seems to be in some form of fancy dress. This is him, this huge portrait of him at the end of the Great Hall is actually him posing as the Roman statesman Cato, with his sister posing as Cato's wife, Marcia, and the one here on the right is him dressed as Rousseau. He actually went on a grand tour to Italy, and on the way in France he met with Rousseau, and this is him posing in Rousseau's clothes as an American merchant. Fun fact, apparently not related to this, but Rousseau actually dressed in his American merchant attire to disguise the fact that he actually had bladder problems apparently and couldn't wear any trousers. So actually that's the story behind why Rousseau dressed in such elaborate clothing. But that's William posing as Rousseau, kind of identifying himself as an enlightened man. The dining room at Burton Constable also undertook a major refurbishment, a very neoclassical scheme. With the exception of the colour of the walls, this room's actually exactly how it was when it was first commissioned in the 1760s. The only difference was the walls would have been a kind of Georgian powder pink originally, and the green is a Victorian edition. But other than that, the room remains untouched. You then have the next transformation of the house in the Victorian area, where because Burton Constable didn't have any children, if there wasn't a direct male, if it didn't pass to a son, it often tended to pass to a nephew. So it passed to the Cliffords of Tixall Hall in Staffordshire, who then assumed the name Constable. And this plays a key in the collections that we have as well, because you have two ancestral households merging, and the family actually chose to relocate from Tixall Hall in Staffordshire. They brought a lot of their artworks, a lot of their fine furniture and ancestral belongings with them, and Tixall later was sold and demolished, so we have this kind of wealth of new material coming to the hall then. And the Victorian era really kind of breathed a feminine touch into a house like Burton Constable. Sir Thomas Aston married his cousin, as was the done thing in those days. He married his cousin Mary Ann, and her sister occupied the house. They were great lovers of theatricals. They put on musical soirees, amateur dramatics and other things. They even created a theatre at Burton Constable. And you see the Victorian alterations to many of the rooms actually bringing about this feminine touch, and the Victorians like to gilt everything as well and cover it all in gold. But a notable transformation of one of the rooms was actually inspired by the sisters. They visited the Royal Pavilion at Brighton around 1830 and were so inspired by the chinoiserie architecture of the pavilion that they decided to create their very own Chinese room at Burton Constable. So this is the Chinese room, complete with colossal, great gilded carved dragons, which were commissioned by a local Hull carpenter, who I'm pretty sure never had a commission like that ever again. So why did Burton Constable need to be saved? Well, this was due to its downfall in the 20th century. The Constables were one of the wealthiest landowners were once one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. However, by the early 20th century, most of their wealth had depleted. There is a number of contributing factors to this. However, the family tend to blame the bulk of their misfortune on this lady. This is a lady called Rosina Brandon, and she was the mistress of Sir Thomas Aston Clifford Constable. And following the death of his wife, Sir Thomas actually elected to marry his mistress, who was the daughter of a coachmaker from Ipswich, pretty much a nobody, and was a bit of a Victorian gold digger and caused quite the scandal of the time. And she spent lavishly. She completely refurbished both Burton Constable Hall, and they had a London Thameside villa called Dunbar House, with luxurious furniture and other artworks and items. And when Sir Thomas Aston died, in his will, he didn't leave her a great sum of money, but he left a first refusal of the contents of all of their households, and she took the lot. So in the late 19th century, the house was pretty much plundered of its contents, and Sir Thomas Aston's son writes in a letter she left him all but his rocking horse. So she left him nothing but his rocking horse. Now there was a little bit of an upside to this. She went on to live quite a colourful life and married several times again, was widowed several times again, ended up in Italy, and in her final few years she decided that she wanted to be buried at the family mausoleum at Helsham with her first husband. So she did a bit of a deal with the family that she would will back the items of furniture that she had in exchange to be buried there. So a lot of the collections did come back, however a lot of them at this point had also been sold off, and the house was already in a bit of a state, but nevertheless they came back in 1908, and the deal was upheld, and there she is buried in the family mausoleum. Interestingly, not as Lady Clifford Constable, and she's the only tombstone that doesn't say R.I.P. on it. But Sir Thomas Aston's son wasn't much better actually. He too took a mistress who he had two illegitimate children to, and left her a considerable sum in his will. So needless to say, the money had all gone. And a building like Burton Constable requires a considerable amount of upkeep. The hall was abandoned shortly after the First World War for about, I think it's abandoned for about 30 to 40 years, which took its toll on the building. So by the time the foundation was created in 1992, there was buckets everywhere to catch the rainwater from the leaking roof. Mould and moths had munched their way through the soft furnishings, woodworm had made itself at home in the Chippendale chairs, and a great many items had found their way into the hands of local antique dealers when the family were frantically selling off collections to try and pay for the never-ending building maintenance. So the late John Chichester Constable made an agreement with the National Heritage Memorial Fund to create what is now the foundation to preserve Burton Constable, to maintain for public benefit Burton Constable to gather its collections and associated buildings, and to conserve them and make them available to members of the public. So that's really where we've been since 1992. The hall was in a terrible state, and one of the first challenges actually, besides fixing the urgent repairs like the leaking roof and so on, was to really kind of prioritise which parts of the hall were the most vulnerable and which needed saving. Our mission is to tell the story of Burton Constable and life on a country house estate, and to present the hall as it would have been when it was the Constable family's home, when the Constable family lived there. However, this isn't actually straightforward because the house was lived in for over several hundred years, each of its occupants bringing new developments of the time, making alterations, putting their own stamp on the house and the collections. So it can pose quite a great number of curatorial challenges when you're trying to decide at what period in time you put a room back to, or to what extent you go to have something conserved or restored. One of the first actions that actually needed to be taken was in the Chinese room, and this is one of the first conservation projects they did of the entire room, where they had to conserve all of the 1830s chinoiserie wallpaper, because those of you who are in the textile department will know textiles and wallpapers tend to be your most vulnerable items, can often be your higher priority items because they can be more susceptible to light damage, pests, damps, moulds, etc. So the Chinese wallpaper was one of the first priorities. Each individual strip or each individual section of wallpaper had to be carefully removed from the wall, treated by a professional wallpaper conservator. It was then relined on a chinoiserie wallpaper before being reinstated back into the room. So at a glance, it doesn't look like a huge amount of work's gone into to putting the room back to how it was, but as you can see, it wasn't actually a straightforward task to do that. Textiles as well were a huge problem. A lot of textiles had suffered from years of neglect. Curtains that had been hung for over 150 years had suffered from the strains pulling the threads, smoke from when the fires were lit and the family used to smoke in the rooms, pests, damp and mould, especially when the hall was abandoned and no heating was going on. So a lot of the textiles were pretty much in a rag condition. So a freelance textile conservator was employed to undergo or to put together a plan of action to restore the textiles. So when you go around the house today, you might not notice, but this is kind of just typical of some of the textile projects that went about. So we had, door pelmets which had been completely lost all their tassels and were in rags, and they've managed to identify some of the tassels that had dropped off them and have the textile conserved and put back to its former glory. A team of volunteers actually were a huge help in this. We had a team of NADFAS volunteers, which is a National Association of Decorative and Fine Arts, and they've really been around for the past 21 years helping assist the textile conservator with projects. This is the reinstating of an 18th century wall hanging which had been incorrectly nailed to a wall against the weave, so it was actually pulling the weight of the items, pulling the item apart. So that was a project to have that taken down, stabilised and rehung. A lot of the chairs throughout the house, this is typical of what light damage can do and frequent use can do to the chairs. A lot of the fibres had come loose, and because they were taking a conservation approach as opposed to a restoration approach, they didn't remove any of the original historical covers, they've actually chosen to painstakingly comb back into place all the loose fibres and apply conservation netting to secure the chairs and make them stable. Same sort of thing with the dining room curtains. Painting conservation as well, a lot of the artworks had to be sent away for specialist cleaning and stuff. Again, this is typical of the sort of skills that we don't have the resources to employ in-house. Back in the day, museums or stately homes like Burton Constable might have been able to afford to have a painting conservator and a furniture conservator, but nowadays we're seeing an increased demand for freelance conservators where you outsource projects like this and send items away for conservation, or even better if you can, have a conservator come in and let visitors see the conservation work taking place. I've included that as well because with the textile department being in here, I will just throw out that there is a bit of a demand for textile conservators in particular. There aren't many freelancers about in this area. We've just lost ours, she's retired to France. So if it's something that interests you, it might be a career option that you've not yet considered. There is a great art and a design element to conservation. I'm not a conservator by trade, but you tend to find that the best ones come from an art and design background, because if it's a case of where a piece of fabric that doesn't survive, they then have to do some research and advise on what would the best course of action be if you're then sourcing new fabrics and such to restore an item, where you source them from. There's a lot of different considerations that goes into them. And the same with paintings. Interestingly, one of the paintings had to be conserved to have a bullet wound removed from it from when the house was occupied during the Second World War. It appears the British Army did more damage than the Germans ever could have done, and used some of the paintings as target practice. I've put the staircase hall in as a typical example of a curatorial dilemma of how to present a room. This room was created in the mid-18th century when the impressive cantilevered staircase, so floating staircase, was first installed. Originally it would have been painted in a kind of a cool bluish grey, like a duck egg colour scheme, which we know of because we have fragments of plaster where we can see the different layers of paint from underneath them. So we know that, we have some historical photographs as well. So we know what the room originally looked like, and no doubt the cool blue colour scheme would have contrasted far more elegantly with the gilded pictures and the once gilded stair rails. However, the present scheme dates to the 1970s, and the bright yellow paint is the choice of the late Mrs. Chichester Constable. Now, at the moment, present day, we've left this room untouched for two reasons. One, that there were other rooms that were a high priority to reinstate and conserve than this one. But also, we've elected to take the decision up until now that the 1970s is still part of the hall's history. It's still part of the family, the ongoing development and the evolution of the hall, and when the family still lived there. However, a curatorial debate could be, do we put the room back to how it would have been in the 18th century, or do we leave it as a tribute to the 1970s? There isn't actually a correct answer for this. I don't know if anyone in here has any opinions on that. This is the sort of challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis. I think for now we'd probably leave it, but it might be a future consideration to try and put it back to the 18th century. Other things that help us when we're deciding on how to dress a room or how to display things or where items go, historical inventories play a key role. One of the things that's quite fortunate about Burton Constable is the amount of archive material that survives. So we know from inventories that were conducted what artworks in particular were in which room, so we can try and put a lot of the paintings and collections back in the rooms that they were in when the family were using them. And photographs as well play a key role in this. Some paintings are quite straightforward. You can probably tell by the size of the painting in the middle there that that's not been moved for a number of years. But historical photographs can also help us when we're trying to repatriate works of art that was sold off. For example, there's a painting on the staircase here. This is Caravaggio's St John the Baptist, which was sold in the early 20th century. We have actually traced this one. Fortunately, it's now in the Nelson Atkinson Museum in Kansas in America, so I don't think we're getting it back. But certainly with some other artworks, if they ever do come up for purchase, it's one of our objectives to try and repatriate those artworks and bring them back to their original context. I've included the Great Drawing Room as a current challenge. Originally created in the 1770s as part of William's grand scheme to modernise the house, about just over half a century later the Victorians tackled this room, breathed a new life into this room, and redecorated the room in this kind of grand crimson and gold scheme. Yellow silk was applied to the walls, and the Chippendale seat furniture were reupholstered in this cream yellow and crimson silk, and there would have been luxurious crimson drapes dressing the window bays. Now back then an army of servant staff would have been on hand to keep the rooms in immaculate condition, but sadly 100 years later that was no longer the case. In an attempt to try and generate income, the family turned the Great Drawing Room into a ballroom during the later 20th century, and they hired it out for private parties and weddings. So as you can probably imagine, the constant exposure to bright sunlight from having the curtains open, the temperature changes and frequently sitting on the furniture had left a lot of the upholstery and a lot of the textiles in this room in very poor condition. So in 2004 we began a funded project to conserve the room, and had a textile conservator employed to preserve the seat upholstery and the wall silk. The backs of the sofas kind of give you an indication of the colours that they would have been before the light damage attacked them. Again, we went for a conservation rather than a reupholstery approach. So even though to look at them to the untrained eye today they look like not a huge amount of work's gone into them, actually you can see from the before photograph that this involved painstakingly combing all the fibres into place, and then a conservator uses specially dyed conservation netting to secure the loose threads and fibres back and protect the seats from further damage. This is a bit of a contrast to an approach taken by the family in the 1970s when they elected to have a second suite of Chippendale chairs and sofas, completely stripped back down to, can you see on the right hand side the chair that's been left unrestored, stripped the furniture completely back to basics and had them reupholstered in a new silk covering and repainted. They did retain the original, so we do have the original covers in storage, but kind of two different approaches to how you might choose to reinstate a room, and I suppose I'll leave it to you as artists and designers to decide which method you would favour. Now, the conservation of the walls and furniture is complete, but with the exception of these pale cream sun curtains, which are a necessity to prevent the room from further light damage, the windows remain there and kind of give a bit of an unfinished look to the room. Now, of the original two valances, only one survives, and that is the condition that it's been left in. The curtains in the second valance have been lost. They decayed and obviously chucked away many years ago. So, as designers and artists, I mean, one of the dilemmas we come across is what would you recommend in this situation, as we have several options. Option one, we could have the original valance that's there conserved, so that it can be rehung, and have a replica made for the second window bay. The pros of that would probably be the best for recreating an accurate representation of the room, but having a replica made of that kind of quality would be extremely expensive. I think I was quoted something around £13,000. which seems a bit excessive. And there is also the dilemma of, will a replica ever completely be an exact match, or will there be a noticeable difference when you hang it to the original that's been conserved? Option 2, you could have 2 exact replicas made, and then you avoid the concern of one of them looking older than the other one, but then you're doubling the expense. Or option 3, do we have a designer or an artist produce 2 new valances which are inspired by the original, but using modern day cheaper materials as a substitute to dress the windows, and then simply put the original valance on display, like in a display case, just to show what the original looked like? Or do we do nothing at all and just leave them bare and explain to visitors that they're bare because we no longer have them? I'm guessing you probably won't want to put your hands up, but I'll leave that one with you. Does anyone have any suggestions of how they would tackle a challenge like this? This is something that we haven't actually made a decision on yet. It's a future project to put the valances back. And then also, what do we do with the curtains? Do we try and find a historical photograph that gives us an accurate representation of the curtains and go to an expense to have reproductions made? Do we simply hang red drapes to be in keeping with the room, or do we leave the curtains bare as well? Another project that we're just about to start involves the reinstating of this room here. This is the carve room project. How am I doing for time? Although it looks quite derelict and a bit uninteresting, the history of this room is actually quite long and complicated. It was once a windowless brick vaulted safe room, which would have been important for keeping land ownership documents fireproof and safe. And in the 18th century it became a very grand gentleman's cabinet or closet room, this idea of a private space for reflecting and contemplation, pretty much like an office room when no doubt William Constable did his curiosity experiments. It was fitted out or decked out with elaborate carved panelling, which was painted, as you can see at the top corner, it should have been painted green and picked out with gilt highlights. It would have had a lovely white Belection style fireplace, and the ceiling would have all been had a plasterwork detail on it, which you can't see the whole of the ceiling from there, but you can see it, none of it really survives. In the Victorian era, the room was painted white, the marble fireplace was taken out and a fire range put in so that it could serve as a housekeeper's room. And then in the mid-20th century, when the family were hiring the ballroom out for wedding functions and such, they decided to bash through one of the walls completely, put holes in the 18th century panelling to install extractor fans, and used the room as a tea serving hatch, which completely destroyed a lot of well, it didn't completely destroy them, but damaged a lot of the original interiors. Now, fortunately, a lot of this panel work does survive, even though there is damage to it. So the project that we've managed to get funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund is to put the room back to its 18th century glory, to have all the panelling sent away to a furniture conservator who will strip back the paintwork, conserve as much of the panelling as he can, and have to make carved replica fillings for the patches that have been lost. The ceiling will be replastered based on a design from another part of the house which is of similar date. A fireplace will be, a marble fireplace will be inserted, which is more in keeping with the 18th century feel of the room, and the panelling will all go back in and the room will be repainted and gilded and presented as William Constable's cabinet room. So that's a decision we've made for this project. Some of you might have had ideas of how you might have done it differently. Some people might think some people even think that maybe we should leave rooms in a completely unrestored state to reflect the downfall of the house. There's many different approaches you can take, which is why we have a curatorial committee team now of several individuals from various backgrounds to try and, I suppose, help ensure that the decisions we make are are right for the house, but there are many different approaches you can take to projects like this, and again it can come down to funding as well. Had we been unsuccessful with a Heritage Lottery grant, then this project wouldn't be able to go ahead. Just a quick contrast, I've just thrown in, those of you who know Sewerby Hall up near Bridlington. They're actually a country house in a bit of a different situation to Burton Constable, so I've just thrown them in as a contrast. They've just undergone a £2.6 million restoration project to put Sewerby Hall back to how it would have been in the Edwardian era, which is around about circa 1900, 1910, which is when the house was last used. Now, the difference with Sewerby is because it's been a local authority building, or owned by the local authority for almost 100 years, none of the original collections and none of the original interiors survived at all. It was pretty much an empty shell. So their curator has had to employ a number of artists and interior designers to study old photographs and try and recreate the rooms as they would have been. I think this involved studying photographs of the historical photographs of the carpet and taking it to a specialist designer and manufacturer to have the pattern reproduced. However, the problem with the photographs were they would have all been black and white, so a bit of research and designer influence needs to go into how you actually get the colour scheme right when you are trying to do a project like this. And no doubt having an exact reproduction carpet made would have taken a huge stint out of their budget, so they wouldn't have been able to do that for the entire house. So in many of the rooms they've elected to employ, they've employed or commissioned specialists to produce textiles for the curtains that are just simply fitting to that era, and put the rooms back. And as you can see, it's got a very kind of clean cut, freshly restored feel to the building, which is a bit of a contrast to that Burton Constable where we've gone down the more conservation rather than restoration route. I'm afraid these are the only images I could nick off of Google for Sewerby Hall, so if you want to see the rest of the restoration project you'll have to go and visit it. But just another example of how interior designers, artists and such can help consult with a project like this. I've just thrown in the fact that the work doesn't stop in the hall, and there's also a number of buildings and restoration projects to do out in the grounds. This is the Orangery at Burton Constable, which, following a parachute bomb that was dropped during the Second World War that landed not far from it, was in a bit of a state. The windows had been blasted out. I think the family had made some efforts to restore it, but it had fallen into neglect and disrepair. So there's been a conservation project to both restore the building and a ceramic and glass specialist to restore the 18th century codestone sculptures. Codestone is a unique sculpture really to the 18th century. It's designed by a woman actually called Mrs. Eleanor Code, who created this ceramic artificial stone mix which produces garden statues that weather a lot better than your average stone sculptures. Unfortunately, somebody who didn't know much about codestone in the 20th century had used various tars, putties and fillers to try and, in their attempts to protect them, they'd filled them with concrete and covered them in several layers of paint, so they'd just completely cracked over the years of frost and weathering, and destroyed most of the sculpture. So a ceramic specialist had to, what you can see before and after there, had to basically strip back all the layers of paint, all the tars, all the putties, all the concrete back to their shell and reconstruct using ceramic conservation techniques to put them back to their former glory. And similar sort of thing with the little roundels. You couldn't actually make out the fact that he was wearing ice skates or that there's a goat in the background. They were just completely covered in paintwork. So the projects don't just finish there. And also recently we had a huge Heritage Lottery funded project to restore the stable block at Burton Constable, which has been to put back the rooms like above the stables where the grooms would have slept, so visitors can now actually go up the stairs, go into the clock tower, see where they would have lived and what stable life would have been like at this time as well. I'm just going to quickly touch on funding for projects, because we wouldn't be able to do the work we do without it, and especially if some of you are considering going down a freelance or a consultant type career route, this will play a key role. Just some of the major funders. Because we're an independent charitable trust, Burton Constable, we have the endowment sort of keeps us ticking over in terms of running costs, but we don't have the funds to do all the conservation projects that we've done if it wasn't for seeking external funding. The Heritage Lottery Fund is actually one of the biggest funders in this area. They're, for those of you who don't know, they're not a publicly funded body at all. It's basically money generated from every time somebody buys a lottery ticket. So if you do work in heritage, you can feel a little bit less guilty every time you waste your money on lottery tickets, that it is going to a good cause. Recently, at Burton Constable, they paid out, or they gave us a grant of £418,000 for the stable block project. However, they fund projects ranging between 10 and 100 grand, and they fund multi-million-pound projects in larger museums as well. Because they tend to have as part of their agenda, they want to know that the work they're doing is benefiting as many people in the community as possible. They always have an activity plan or agenda attached to their projects, and you'll often see adverts for freelance consultants or freelance conservators or artists as part of a Heritage Lottery funded project, which will be for several months, or it'll be a fixed contract to deliver something. So they could actually be a key organisation to look out for in terms of if you are looking for freelance projects, and that they tend to include working with artists in residence, working with artists to deliver community engagement projects and such, and also to actually put together some of their projects as well. There's a lot more to it in terms of, I'm going to touch on exhibition designs, the marketing elements of it, the publicity side of it. Other big funders, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, they fund specific collection, restoration, conservation projects. Arts Council England have a Grants for the Arts programme, which might be of interest to some of you to even just, if you just go on their website, just check out what their eligibility criteria is, because I believe that this can also be for individual artists wanting to do projects as well as organisations like Burton Constable, and it's actually one of the most straightforward funding applications there is. Some of these can bog you down a bit with all the extras that you have to do, all the tick boxes, but the Arts Council Grants for the Art Fund is basically, if it's an art project that has a community benefit, it seems to be quite straightforward to apply. So I'm not going to go into it in great depth, but I would say do just Google some of these names, have a quick look at what they fund and what your eligibility has to be, because it might be something, if you're thinking of setting up as individuals in the future, it might be an option for you to look into. I'll just throw in that the work is nowhere near complete. We still have many rooms of the house that are still unrestored and not open to the public. This is the servant attic room, attic rooms on the top floor, the 14th landing, which unfortunately I don't think is going to be a project anytime soon. It'd be nice if we could have them restored, but there's a bit of an access problem getting up the spiral staircase as well, which would probably limit our funding options. So this might be a future project, but it's quite nice as well having some spaces left in their derelict state to show visitors on behind the scenes tours. Just going slightly on a different approach. I know some people in here might be from a more computer-based graphics design and such. So I just wanted to touch quickly about exhibition designs for museums and heritage sites. You tend to actually find curators are sometimes very bad at exhibition design, and museums are really starting to realise the importance of having clever produce exhibitions that appeal to a wide range of audience, and it's not as simple as it sounds. What can tend to happen is there is a bit of a kind of stereotype of museums being boring and not for people who not for the average people, for people who are only into that sort of thing. And part of that is that you tend to find some kind of old school curators have a tendency to try and put a book on the wall when they do an exhibition. They find something very, very interesting to them and they want to tell everybody else in the world how interesting this is, and they write an essay and put it on a panel and stick it on the wall, and nobody reads it because it looks dull. And actually, if you want people to engage with your collections, if you want them to understand the history of the site, you've got to make it appealing for them. You've got to, there's a lot of different elements that go into, this isn't necessarily the correct way of doing it, I just put an image of a recent one that was done at Burton Constable. But you want to design your text so that it's in bite-sized chunks, that it's easy to read. You want your point to come across if somebody only reads the first couple of lines. You know, imagine if you are a mum with 2 small children and an elderly relative going around a museum. One small child is running off, the other one wants to know what this object is about, and you've got 20 seconds to try and learn what it is and explain it to them. Go. You don't want to be reading an entire essay on a wall. So actually outsourcing to specialists who specialise in exhibition design is becoming more and more popular, especially if it's part of a larger funding project. Then there will be money in the budget to put on a decent panelled exhibition, whether it be temporary or semi-permanent. So for those of you who are quite interested in, you know, graphics and how to actually put together things like this, companies now actually set themselves up, or freelancers set themselves up as exhibition designers, and that might be something that might appeal to one or two of you. And equally, it also comes down to funds. I mean, as museums themselves don't have a huge amount of staffing resources, and we certainly don't have all the digital technology we would require to put together panels like this quickly and effectively, so it's far straightforward and simpler for us to outsource it. Sorry, I'll just put some other examples. So there's things like, also there's companies that set themselves up that specialise in heritage trails, specialise in the weatherproof boards that you see about places. You know, somebody has to design these and put these together. Also, some of you who are interested in maybe architecture and graphic, there's a bit of a market out there for people who can do digital and drawings of recreations, so to speak. So for example, this isn't Burton Constable, this is one I pulled off the internet, but if you're an archaeology site and you don't actually have physical remains that people can see, you might want to commission an artist to use the evidence you have to recreate a drawing of what the village would have looked like. So there is a bit of a demand for people who can put together floor plans, can do accurate, I mean this is a work in progress to show where the medieval village would have been at Burton Constable, but that might be something that appeals to some of you in here. And lastly, I was just going to finish off with some other opportunities there might be for artists and designers to work with heritage sites like Burton Constable. Often curators tend to be don't tend to have the time or the resources to do as much as they would like to do and to put on as many exhibitions as they would like. They tend to have a lot of spaces to fill, especially if you have a historic building like Burton Constable. So if you're an artist with a ready-made exhibition, it can be a bit of a win-win situation for both of you. So it would always be worth, if you had an idea, approaching a museum with an idea for something. This is a ceramic exhibition that was put in the hall a couple of years ago. It's a couple of local ceramic artists who did a series of contemporary exhibitions inspired by various parts of the house, and they exhibited them in situ, basically using Burton Constable as an alternative gallery backdrop. It was a ready-made exhibition for us, and it was basically a free gallery for them where they could display and sell their artworks. So there's lots of different options. So this is just some images from that. They used the Chinese room inspired to do a procession. The blue pots were inspired by the Burton Constable whale and kind of creating a sea of, or a pool of water effect. This is the trail leaflet that sort of went with it. Some sculptures in the parkland. This was a little bit challenging. I suppose lesson learnt to me to always check what the artists are actually producing before it goes in. This was open to opinions. One of the artists was inspired by the picture of Coriolanus's mother begging Coriolanus to spare the city of Rome, and she wanted to do a figurine of the mother in her begging pose, but I didn't realise that her sculptures came like this, so that was an interesting one to put in. Other similar exhibitions that are kind of not to do with the history of the whole per se, but examples of how contemporary artists can use a place like Burton Constable as a backdrop. This was done before I was curator there. This was a series of sculptures of leather animals by a local East Riding artist who just displayed them throughout the time. It was just, throughout the hall, which is, again, a good bit of fun. It attracted quite a lot of visitors, especially visitors with young children, and was making just good use of the hall as a backdrop for these animals. They played on the Burton Constable's collection of curiosities as a fitting theme to display them throughout the house. And also we had an exhibition using papier-mâché figurines of Alice in Wonderland characters, which tied in with some artist panels that we had from the 1970s, where a local artist had done an entire series of Alice in Wonderland set for one of the family members, so this was just touching on that. So you can be creative with the types of contemporary works that you choose to put in a house like this. Places like Bert and Agnes as well kind of establish themselves to do artists in residencies. If you are thinking of setting yourself up as an artist or a freelancer, the great thing about places like that is they already have kind of established clientele. They already have a number of visitors passing through that are interested in commissioning those types of artworks or might be interested in purchasing. So in exchange for paying whatever small fee they charge for you to occupy their artist in residency space for a couple of weeks, you might get a lot more commissions and such. So there are lots of different ways to go about it. So that's pretty much it for today. Hopefully I've just given you a bit of a taste of the many different opportunities there can be for artists and designers to go into the museum and heritage industry, and what sort of projects and roles that we undertake that you might not have known about before. So thank you. And does anybody have any questions?
I had a couple just quick ones, Kelly. I was interested when you said that there was like an ongoing project, it seemed, to acquire back all of the artworks which have been lost. And I guess I was thinking in the back of my mind, I was surprised that, and I don't know whether this maybe ever happened, whether there's a scheme where you said, well, let's not try and acquire them, let's try and have excellent reproductions of them, that are kind of indistinguishable to the layperson, and rehang them, because like one of them was a Caravaggio, and you're not going to see change out of 5 million for that.
Yeah.
So that's never going to happen. So I just wondered whether there was an approach like that.
That is actually an interesting approach, and I do know some museums that have taken that kind of approach where they've realised they're never going to get this artwork back, so to kind of interpret it to visitors that this is where it originally came from, they've had a massive reproduction. Personally, I've kind of always, especially when you put them in amongst all the original paintings, you never get them quite right. Obviously, if you do it, no matter how high a resolution it is, you'll always get quite a flat, obvious reproduction, especially if you're putting it amongst several of the original paintings. I think if you had a completely blank canvas, so if it was a painting to stand alone at the end of a hall or on a staircase which wasn't surrounded, you'd probably get away with it a lot more. It's not something like we've actually considered, but it might be something we look to for the future. Again, it's whether we can get funding to have something of quality produced. It's whether it look fitting with the rest of the collections. Maybe in a few years' time, technology will improve and there'll be more realistic ways of putting them into place. So yeah, it's not something we've considered yet, but it is an option, and a lot of places do have decided to go down that route.
Right, yeah, so I wasn't aware of, and I maybe just going to ask as well, because that idea of the circle and the ring marking funding for something, I was surprised because the whole idea of a country house is to see almost how the other side lived, so the working and middle classes now go kind of looking around how did the aristocracy live. And obviously there's a kind of an ethical issue there about class and one class pervading the other class. And so I was surprised maybe there hadn't been some restoration of the servants' quarters, or I didn't know if there had been.
Oh, there hasn't. The tricky thing with Burton Constable, and it's just in sort of our particular circumstances, that what would have been the servants' wing and the kitchens is now the family's private residence. So what would have been the Victorian kitchen is now their sitting room. So we've lost that part of the building, which is one of the reasons why we managed to get the funding to do the stable block project, because that's sort of our way of, that's the only building we have which represents the working side of it. So we've tried to recreate that element and put kind of the working farm side and the grounds and the estate side of what life was like on a country house estate in those buildings instead. If we had the original kitchens as of servants' wing, then it would be great to put that back, and maybe that's something we could do in future years with the unrestored servants' rooms in the attics. But at the moment, that's how we've sort of substituted that element.
I was going to ask, you just mentioned the family, if anybody actually still live. Do they have any say in what goes on? Are they on committees?
Yes, they are still around. They are still quite actively involved. They live they occupy the south wing now. So the hall itself belongs to the foundation. So it's a museum to be open to the general public. So the south wing is their private residence, but they are both trustees, and one of them serves on the curatorial committee as well. So they are still actively involved in the decisions that the foundation make and the running of the place, which is quite nice. So it's in a bit of a state of trust at the moment because Mr. Constable passed away and he has one daughter, so it will pass to his grandson, he's only just finished university and he's not quite ready to.
So the foundation owns the building. Are they leased? Do they then lease?
Yeah, it's on whatever the maximum lease was, several $100-year lease, but it has to be the family. They can't sublet it. It has to be the family that lives there.
I just wondered, is there some kind of national register of paintings that are held, or sculptures that are held in stately homes, whether they're council or private?
Yes, there is for paintings. The Public Catalogue Foundation did it was a BBC project a few years ago, which is called Your Paintings. If you just Google PCF Your Paintings, it'll bring up, because I don't know the full website address. And that's basically a online catalogue of all paintings in public ownership, if that makes sense. It's not been applied yet to private collections, so all the collections that Burton Constable have that are either the Leeds Museum ones or ours are on there, but the ones that are private in the south wing won't be. So there is actually, I should have mentioned that actually one of the things that museums as a general broad across the sector and heritage sites are doing is trying to make collections more and more accessible, and I think making collections available online is pretty much the future of where this is going, but it's a time consuming and expensive task to do. So like the paintings, that was a massive funded project that the BBC did to have all the paintings made online. It'd be quite nice if eventually we could have our entire collection made accessible online so that researchers can, a bit like the British Museum Explore, where you go on their Explore website and you can search individual items in the collection, sometimes which aren't even on display, some of them will be in store. It would be quite nice to do that. It's just, again, it's funding and it's time, and when museums are getting less and less funds to employ permanent staff, it becomes a bit of a challenge, but I think that's the way, certainly in the next 10 to 15 years, collections will start to go.